On March 180 AD, Marcus Aurelius, the philosopher king who guided Rome through decades of plague and warfare, died near Vienna. With his death, a two-century streak of stability known as the Pax Romana came to a sudden halt. For nearly 100 years, Roman emperors had chosen their successors based on merit, adopting highly capable generals to take the throne. Commodus broke that streak. He was the first in a century to inherit the empire simply because he was the boss's son. Marcus Aurelius had tried to prepare him, surrounding the boy with the greatest stoic minds and rhetoricians of the era. But the Roman historians noted that the young heir was entirely uninterested in philosophy. Instead, he showed a distinct inclination toward lewdness and cruelty from a very early age. According to the historical text Historia Augusta, when Commodus was just 12 years old, he ordered a bathkeeper thrown into a blazing furnace simply because his bathwater had been drawn too cool. A slave burned a sheepskin to produce the stench of burning flesh, just to pacify the boy's rage. The empire required a seasoned, stoic leader to manage its overextended frontiers. Instead, absolute power was handed to an untested teenager who viewed the world entirely through the lens of his own immediate desires. His very first act as sole emperor was to abandon the grueling, multi-year campaign his father had waged against the Germanic tribes along the Danube. Commodus hastily signed a peace treaty, packed up the imperial court, and returned to the lavish comforts of Rome. This retreat alienated the seasoned generals and traditional elites. Tensions festered for 2 years, until 182 AD, when a group of senators, orchestrated by Commodus's own sister, Lucilla, decided the young emperor had to be removed. As Commodus entered a dark passageway, a cloaked assassin stepped out from the shadows and lunged at the emperor with a drawn dagger, but the assassin made a fatal error. Before driving the blade home, he shouted, "See, this is what the Senate has sent you." That brief pause gave the bodyguards enough time to tackle the man to the ground. The plot had failed, but the damage was irreversible. His sister tried to murder him. Trusting the Senate was impossible. Commodus withdrew physically from the capital, spending most of his time isolated in sprawling country estates at Lanuvium, surrounded by a massive personal harem of hundreds of women. To run the empire in his absence, he systematically bypassed the Senate. He handed control of the state apparatus to a succession of trusted chamberlains and freedmen, men who held no noble titles and owed their power entirely to his favor. The most notorious of these was Cleander, a Phrygian former slave who took control of the Praetorian Guard. As this diagram illustrates, under Cleander, the Roman government became a highly lucrative market. He actively sold off patrician statuses, provincial governorships, and even seats in the Senate to the highest bidder to enrich himself and the imperial treasury. By 190 AD, this deep corruption caught up with them. A severe grain shortage, likely engineered by Cleander's political rivals, caused widespread starvation in the capital. The desperate Roman mob rioted and marched directly on the emperor's estate outside the city. Terrified by the thousands of starving citizens surrounding his walls, Commodus saved his own life the only way he could. He threw his favorite puppet to the wolves, executing Cleander and tossing his severed head to the mob. After his family betrayed him and his hand-picked loyalists failed him, Commodus concluded that human alliances offered no reliable protection. Having lost faith in his family and his ministers, he turned to a power he felt was beyond the reach of an assassin's blade: divinity.
If mortals were flawed and treacherous, his new defense would be to transcend humanity entirely. Commodus began presenting himself as the literal, living reincarnation of the demigod Hercules. He commissioned statues depicting himself wearing the skin of the Nemean lion and wielding a massive club, demanding that the public worship him as a divine figure. He went so far as to overwrite the physical reality of the empire. He formally renamed the city of Rome to Colonia Commodiana, Commodus's colony. He even changed the names of all 12 months of the calendar to match his own 12 imperial titles. This was the psychological shield of a terrified autocrat who believed that if he could not be loved, he had to be feared as something beyond man. To project a terrifying image of physical invincibility, Commodus took his god complex into the arena. He became the only Roman emperor in history to publicly fight in the Colosseum, stepping onto the sand as a heavily armored gladiator known as a secutor. The displays were grotesquely rigged. He fought compliant opponents who intentionally yielded to avoid execution. He clubbed disabled citizens who had been tied together to resemble mythical giants, and slaughtered thousands of captive exotic animals, reportedly killing over 100 bears in a single day with arrows from a safe balcony. The historian Cassius Dio, who was forced to watch from the stands, recorded a deeply disturbing incident. After decapitating an ostrich in the arena, Commodus walked over to the senatorial section. Holding the bloody head in one hand and his sword in the other, he silently grinned at the terrified senators, who had to chew on their laurel wreaths just to hide their nervous laughter. Legislative governance and statecraft had been entirely replaced by performative terror. The emperor had turned the highest office in the world into a lethal, narcissistic circus. The breaking point arrived on New Year's Eve, 1902 AD. Commodus announced his plan to inaugurate the upcoming year not in the traditional purple robes of state, but by marching out of the gladiator barracks in full arena armor. His inner circle begged him not to disgrace the office so thoroughly. In a fit of rage, Commodus drafted a prescription list of those marked for execution the next morning. But a young boy playing in the palace found the tablet and handed it to Marcia, Commodus's favorite concubine. At the very top of the death list, she read her own name. Knowing they had mere hours to live, Marcia rushed to the chamberlain, Eclectus, and the Praetorian prefect, Latus. Together they hatched a desperate, preemptive plot to murder the living god. Marcia slipped poison into the emperor's wine, but Commodus, a heavy drinker, vomited it up and staggered into his private bath to recover. Before he could raise the alarm, the conspirators sent in Narcissus, the emperor's personal wrestling trainer, who overpowered Commodus and strangled him in the water. The moment his death was confirmed, the Senate joyfully passed a decree of damnatio memoriae. They physically erased his name from public records, toppled his Hercules statues, and declared him a public enemy. But removing Commodus did not fix the empire. Without a clear successor, the military structure collapsed into civil war. Rome was instantly plunged into the chaotic Year of the Five Emperors, where the throne was literally auctioned off to the highest bidder by the Praetorian Guard. The paranoia cascade ended the Antonine dynasty and dismantled the institutional trust his father had spent decades building. This shift signaled the transition into what historian Cassius Dio called an empire of rust and iron, a future defined by military coups and the slow decay of the state.